east and northeast England. Those are the most likely places. But the fog will lift quickly by 9 or 10 a.m. Fog free and sunny once again. 1 or 2 showers again possible for the northern Scotland, perhaps eastern England, but for the vast majority it's just another sunny day and feeling warm once again. Temperatures very similar to Tuesday with highs of 17 to 19 Celsius fairly widely from Scotland down through England and Wales. Now into Wednesday evening, we're going to see the cloud-free skies continue, and that will lead on to another sunny day countrywide on Thursday. I think on Friday there'll be a bit more cloud in the far north and northwest, but sunshine returns on Saturday.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello and welcome to The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, this afternoon. Now this hour we bring you the latest on Ukraine, but also how it's affecting Britain. We'll also be previewing tomorrow's spring statement, the mini-budget, and we endeavour to find out how people across the country can beat the financial squeeze. But first, here are the latest GB News headlines.
Good afternoon, it's 1 minute past 3. I'm Rhiannon Jones in the GB newsroom. Poland's pushing for Russia's exclusion from the G20. The country says it's received a positive response to the suggestion, with the request now in the hands of the US. In Ukraine, the Foreign Ministry says 300,000 people trapped in the occupied city of Kherson are now running out of food and medical supplies. The country is also pleading with Russia to let citizens leave Mariupol. The Deputy Prime Minister claims Russian forces are blocking humanitarian corridors and preventing supplies from reaching the city. Addressing the Italian Parliament via video link earlier, President Volodymyr Zelensky urged Western countries to increase sanctions against Moscow.
Support more sanctions against Russia. Support a full embargo on trade, starting with oil. Support a ban against Russian ships arriving to your ports, so they get to pay the price for their aggression and the mining of the sea. There should be no exceptions of the sanctions for any Russian bank.
Volodymyr Zelensky there. Meanwhile, the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres is calling for an end to what he described as an absurd war, saying the conflict is going nowhere fast.
This war is unwinnable. Sooner or later, it will have to move from the battlefield to the peace table. And that is inevitable. The only question is how many more lives must be lost? How many more bombs must fall? How many Mariupols must be destroyed? How many more Ukrainians and Russians will be killed before everyone realizes that this war has no winners, only losers?
Jailed Kremlin critic Alexei Navalny has been sentenced to 9 years in a maximum security prison for large-scale fraud. Navalny's one of President Putin's most prominent critics. He's already serving a 2.5-year sentence for parole violations related to charges he says are fabricated. Boris Johnson's spokesperson has accused Vladimir Putin of using trumped-up charges against those seeking to hold him to account. In other news, a 22-year-old man has appeared in court charged with the murder of Sabita Tanwani. The 19-year-old died at student accommodation in Clerkenwell in central London in the early hours of Saturday morning. Tunisian national Maher Marouf, of no fixed address, has also been accused of attacking a police officer. He's been remanded in custody until Thursday. Neighbours of a 17-month-old girl who died after a dog attack at her home have spoken of their shock. Residents in the Blackbrook area of St Helens have described Bella Ray Birch as a beautiful little girl. The dog had only been with the family a week. It's since been put down. Merseyside police are appealing for witnesses and anyone who has any information on the dog.
Ray has lost her life in the most unimaginably terrible circumstances. Detailed investigations are continuing into this tragic event. Forensic examinations to determine the dog's breed are ongoing, and we are working to identify all the previous owners of the dog so we can establish its history.
The Metropolitan Police's approach to tackling corruption isn't fit for purpose. That's according to a regulator. The report, ordered by the Home Secretary, found its procedures for rooting out corrupt staff are fundamentally flawed and that it failed to learn lessons from the unsolved murder of private investigator Daniel Morgan back in 1987. 20 recommendations for change within the force were given. The Met Police has welcomed the findings and acknowledges it needs improvement. The number of COVID patients in Scotland's hospitals has reached a record high for the second day in a row. Official figures show 2,221 people are currently in hospital with the virus. There were almost 12,000 new cases and 37 deaths reported in the country. It comes as other parts of the UK are also experiencing a surge in cases, with Wales and England seeing a sharp increase. This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens. Now let's return to the briefing with Tom Harwood.
Coming up on this hour on The Briefing, we bring you the latest on the invasion of Ukraine throughout the show, with President Biden stating earlier today that Putin's back is against the wall as Russian forces stall or make only limited progress across Ukraine. And as the West has appeared united on sanctions against Russia, are there finally cracks starting to appear in the EU's response? Well, we'll get the latest from Berlin. And has the invasion of Ukraine put the Partygate in the rearview mirror for voters? We speak to Tory polling expert Lord Hayward. And give me your political briefing. Send in your views and opinions by emailing gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet me at gbnews. Welcome to the show this afternoon. Well, in the last few hours, there has been some encouraging news from Ukraine. Russian troops have been forced out of an important Kiev suburb after Ukraine regained control as Putin's invasion continues to face fierce resistance. The regained territory allowed Ukrainian forces to retake control of a key highway and block Russian troops from surrounding Kiev from the northwest. According to British intelligence, Putin's forces are largely stalled in place after, quote, yet another day of limited progress. And on the home front, the cost of living crisis is really starting to bite across the country, with warnings from experts that the situation is dire and that the Chancellor needs to do more. Well, tomorrow the Chancellor will have the chance to do precisely that as he delivers his spring statement to the Commons. And you can watch that here on a GB News special with coverage starting from 11 a.m. Well, joining me now to discuss all of the varied news we have this morning is the Conservative MP for Boston and Skegness, Matt Warman. Welcome to the programme, Matt. First of all, we've got to talk about the Chancellor's statement tomorrow. There's been a lot of speculation as to what may be in it. What measures would you like to see to ease the cost of living?
Well, I think you're absolutely right to say the cost of living is the main thing the Chancellor needs to address. When I talk to my constituents, the thing that comes up time and time again is the cost of fuel. And that is not just the cost of petrol and diesel, but also things like heating oil, gas and electricity as well. So I think what I'd like to see is a package of measures that addresses those issues. We've seen some headlines over the weekend around cutting VAT on fuel, for instance. I don't think it necessarily has to specifically be that, but something that addresses those sorts of issues would be something that tackles what is really frightening people at the moment about monthly outgoings.
Yeah, there's been a lot of criticism of this Chancellor that potentially he might be taking with one hand and giving back with another. Is it tax cuts that you'd like to see rather than spending handouts? Because, of course, there's that national insurance rise that seems to be coming down the road in any case.
Well, I think the Chancellor's been pretty clear that the national insurance rise has to stay, and that is because ultimately we've got to pay in the long term for social care and in the short term for the NHS backlog. I think everyone does support getting that backlog under control, but there are things that we could do about making sure that it doesn't hit the lowest paid in particular. There are things that I hope the Chancellor can do around the threshold for when it kicks in, that sort of thing, where we do, I think, very clearly see that the ground has shifted from when we were talking about these things in the very first instance a few months ago. And I think that the Chancellor has been very keen to listen, and I think we will see some results around that tomorrow. But ultimately, all of these bits of expenditure do have to be paid for. And so I think we need a bit of a balance that says tax cuts are obviously what we would like to all see, but they can't come without recognising that there's a lot of appetite for serious public spending to redress COVID, and that has to be paid for in the long term.
I suppose there's a lot of speculation around the fact that you and your colleagues have got a 3-line whip for Thursday. Now, this is pretty unusual in terms of telling Conservative MPs to stick around in Westminster when ordinarily you might be travelling back to your constituencies. What does that tell you about the potential for more significant changes than may be expected tomorrow?
Well, I think it's worth saying that that 3-line whip hasn't been completely confirmed, but it has been widely reported, and it is what a lot of people are expecting. That would indicate that there are things that require the consent of the House of Commons. That might be, for instance, around that national insurance rise. I think lots of people, as I say, would welcome something that both acknowledges that we do have to address that NHS backlog. Of course we do. No one wants to be waiting for longer than they could for an operation, but doing so in such a way that it acknowledges that the Chancellor has got a bit of a windfall from petrol rises and from broader receipts into the Treasury. That means that maybe there is some wiggle room, and therefore I think everyone will be more than happy to stick around on a Thursday because that will be something that makes a real difference to all of our constituents.
Well, let's hope so. Let's move this conversation slightly further forward now, because, of course, what has been going on in Ukraine for the last 3 weeks now is obviously having an effect on Britain as well. Ukraine, a large exporter of wheat, and, of course, Russia, a superpower when it comes to energy. Sanctions are being applied pretty heavily by this country. Of course, the United Kingdom has applied the most sanctions of any country in the world when it comes to Russian banks, and we're catching up with other countries when it comes to oligarchs as well. Do you worry that there will come a point where the cost-benefit balance with regard to sanctions, the political calculation, starts to tip if people start seeing these sanctions really affect people in the United Kingdom as well?
So constituents constituents have been in touch to say that they worry about the impact that a war that they support us in our support of Ukraine will still have an impact in their pockets. And of course, we all sympathise. But what we have to bear in mind ultimately, I think, is that it will be far more expensive if we allow Vladimir Putin to continue in his endeavours to go into Kyiv, into places that would pose a threat further west of Ukraine. So yes, it is a huge challenge. I think the British government needs to level with the British people about what the costs of that could be, and you've seen some of that from the Chancellor and the Prime Minister already. But if we don't act now, it will be more expensive in the longer term. So I do think it's right to pursue the approach with Putin that we are currently pursuing, and it's right to hold our nerve in that, because it is economically the right thing, and of course it is also the right thing to do in the face of aggression within Europe.
Certainly, it seems like there are a lot of bad options here, and doing nothing might well encourage further incursions, potentially into more countries, larger scale war, and then an even tighter squeeze on the cost of living. One consequence of this invasion and of reassessing our energy needs as a country is that the government will be bringing forward a new energy strategy. I'm told by the end of this month we'll be seeing a greater degree of ambition towards energy independence within the United Kingdom. And a key strand of that seems to be nuclear power, something that now there is a growing cross-party consensus on, whereas before it was more controversial, potentially a decade or more ago. What's your thoughts, Matt Warman, on the idea that we really do need to go hell for leather for nuclear power in this country?
So I think nuclear power has not been a sufficient part of the mix for far too long. It's only been this government relatively recently that has been able to back Hinkley. The idea of backing further nuclear power, both in terms of small reactors and in terms of large reactors, seems to me the only way we're going to get through the current crisis. Renewables are great, they make a big difference, but they're not going to be sufficient to ever get us out of that hole. So for me, particularly small nuclear reactors, but larger plants as well, are really important in proving that we can genuinely not have to rely either on fossil fuels or on Russian gas.
Of course, there's been some reporting that the Chancellor doesn't seem to be as supportive of this drive for nuclear than the Prime Minister is. There seems to have been a bit of a rift between the Prime Minister, who wants to push for this nuclear power, this energy independence, and the Chancellor, who, of course, will have to pay for it all. What's your assessment of that rift?
So I think that rift, as you put it, is firmly in the category for me of don't believe everything you read in the papers. What I do see from both the Chancellor and from the Prime Minister is absolute certainty that a different energy mix from the one that we have at the moment, an energy mix that relies more on nuclear, increases the importance of renewables, is exactly where they want to go. Of course, the Treasury is always going to have an eye on how do we pay for it, but I don't see anything coming from the Treasury that denies the fundamentals there, which are that we need to be more independent and to have a greater diversity.
Well, Matt Warman, thank you for talking us through those issues there. And of course, we wait with bated breath for the Chancellor's statement tomorrow, immediately following Prime Minister's questions. Thanks for joining us this afternoon on The Briefing.
Thank you, John.
Well, now joining me is the Alba Party MP, Neil Hanvey, to continue this conversation. And Neil, I do want to start on that issue of nuclear power that I was just talking with Matt about, because it's a slightly different situation in Scotland compared to the rest of the UK. The Scottish Government has instituted for some years now a ban on new nuclear power stations being built within Scotland. Is that something you're supportive of?
I'm not supportive of new nuclear. I would be interested in new nuclear technologies that are safer and have a much larger or much smaller impact on the environment in the years after they've been productive. But you mentioned, I think one of your guests mentioned a moment ago about Russia being an energy superpower. Well, you know, that is exactly the profile of Scotland. Scotland is an energy superpower. We produce more energy through renewable means than we actually use as a country. We've got a quarter of Europe's renewable reserves, and of course we've got we're replete with North Sea oil and gas, which is a really important asset, given the situation in Ukraine and the pressure not just on the small amount of gas imports that we have in the UK, but in supporting Europe and their transition from their reliance on energy from Russia onto more sustainable means in the future. So I think that there is a discussion to be had around how nuclear energy may be advanced with newer technologies. But at the moment, myself and I would say my party are not in favour of an expansion of nuclear energy. There are tremendous opportunities in Scotland to completely rethink how energy is generated and delivered, moving away from a national grid system, which makes investment in Scotland prohibitive because of the transmission costs that are inherent with a national grid system, and it would allow energy to be generated and consumed locally, and for the communities who host that energy generation to see some meaningful community benefit by way of jobs and revenues from the energy source.
That's an interesting prospectus there, moving away from a national grid model to a more localised system, although that may have some knock-on effects in terms of if one part of the system goes down, maybe people are more at risk from power outages. I do want to just refer back to that idea of North Sea oil and gas, of course, an amazing resource for our country at the moment, although we have committed to phasing that out, likely over the course of this decade. Whilst it is clearly very important now for us and indeed for Europe as we move away from Russian oil and gas, that will one day turn off, and probably one day fairly soon. When it comes to that point,
I think there's going to be a continued need for oil and gas for a variety of different reasons. It's the important question is, how do we offset the carbon impact of that in a meaningful way? And that's why myself and other Scottish MPs are continuing to push the government to authorise the Scottish cluster and the Acorn project so that we can do some meaningful work in carbon capture and storage. I have two large plants in my constituency at Mossmoran, one run by Shell, one run by ExxonMobil. And there's a real opportunity there because they're connected to the St Fergus pipeline in the north of Scotland, the northeast of Scotland, and they are absolutely perfectly placed to start to explore how carbon capture and storage can happen in situ when the products are being used. And so, for example, the ethylene plant at Mossmoran, we will continue to need ethylene for the high quality, robust plastics that will be used to build whether hydrogen cell or electric cars for the future. So there will be a continued need for hydrocarbons, but it's how we use them in a responsible way that's the fundamental question, and that's a point that I've been exploring with the government.
I suppose the scale of those hydrocarbons matters. When it comes to talking about baseload energy, it's all very well and good going very heavily for example, wind or indeed solar, but those aren't always particularly reliable sources. So when it comes to having a baseload energy supply that can weather when it's not so windy or when it's dark, isn't nuclear power there quite reliable? Albeit there are one or two issues when it comes to storing the decommission of a plant.
Yeah, well, for high usage periods, so when the ad break comes on a certain program, those historical analogies that people tell when there's an increased demand on energy because of domestic usage. There are ways to deal with that already, but we're just not investing in them that are not nuclear. So there is hydro energy, so the Corrie Glass pumped system, where that gives you water that can generate energy very, very quickly. But there's also really encouraging developments in tidal energy that can store and supply energy instantaneously in the way that you describe. So there are many other methods that are of a much lower environmental impact that generate energy in the way that you describe, but they don't suffer from the anxieties that new nuclear gives to many, many people, including myself.
And just finally, I can't let you go without talking about, of course, the big event in Parliament tomorrow, the Chancellor's statement. What would you like to see from Rishi Sunak when it comes to helping deal with this cost of living crisis?
Well, I mean, I'm afraid the Chancellor has got his work cut out for him, because what he's faced with is the consequence of 12 years of austerity that has stifled the economy. So there's no buoyancy in the economy. Wages have been stagnating throughout that period. There's a gig economy for employment. People don't feel secure in their jobs. The P&O fiasco is a very good example of race to the bottom employment practices, and absolutely shameful. But the government policies are only furthering those types of challenges. So, for example, with free ports, that's a perfect situation where you begin that similar kind of thing to P&O, where you're offshoring jobs onshore, if you like. So jobs that should be located in the UK or in any one of our constituent countries, they're being offshored effectively because companies have not had a condition built into their operating license to ensure that local employment is provided and it's secure and it meets the kind of standards that we have. So in terms of what he can do, he can probably tinker around the edges, but he has his own targets for borrowing and debt management that are going to constrain him massively. And at the moment, we know that the real impact of the cost of living crisis is beginning to bite not just on the low-income families, who the Resolution Foundation have said are facing a 10% inflation rate in the coming year, but it's beginning to bite into people who were previously the kind of folk who would donate to food banks so that poorer people could have some food on the table. And they're now beginning to watch their budgets much, much more closely because their energy costs have tripled. The cost of petrol for their car has gone through the roof.
No doubt we will be also looking at the Chancellor's statement very closely tomorrow as well. I'm afraid we're running up against an ad break now, but for now, Neil Hanvey, thank you for joining us on the briefing this afternoon and talking through those issues. Good to get your perspective, as well, of course, of Matt Moorman, who we heard earlier. Now, coming up, are the cracks starting to appear in the EU's response to the invasion of Ukraine? We'll be discussing all of that after a short break.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood, and every weekday we bring you The Briefing live from 9:30 a.m. The stories, analysis, and live debate that you need to hear.
Quite right, Tom, of course.
Was this something that has been considered at all?
Difficult to answer.
Gas-guzzling helicopters circling. Noise is being made here. Joe Biden walking out. Thank you very much for joining us. Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, Monday to Friday, 9:30 a.m. on GB News.
Join me, Gloria De Piero, Monday to Thursday at noon for The Briefing. We go to the parts of Parliament that you won't see elsewhere. Plus, there's exclusive interviews with MPs from all parties.
But quite often, they paper over the real truth. Why does a working class lad like you join the Tories?
That's a good question.
Don't miss it, Monday to Thursdays at noon on GB News.
Welcome back to The Briefing. Now, with the West so far appearing very united in its response to Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, there potentially appear to be some cracks beginning to form in the EU's response to the crisis. So far, European governments have been unable to agree on whether their next step should be a high-profile move such as banning imports of Russian oil, despite calls to do so from Ukraine's neighbour Poland and the Baltics. However, Germany, in comparison to some EU nations, have signalled their intentions to go further on ending its reliance on Russian energy by brokering a gas deal with Qatar. Well, joining me now from Berlin is freelance German correspondent Thomas Sparrow. Welcome to the programme, Thomas. First of all, let's talk a little bit about the European Union's approach to sanctions. Because whilst the United Kingdom and Canada in particular have been pushing to go further on the SWIFT banking system, there seem to be some EU countries, Belgium, Germany and potentially France, that are holding back on going the full way on SWIFT. Why is that?
Well, one of the options is indeed including further Russian banks in the SWIFT ban. So that is certainly something that is also being discussed in the European Union, that for sure. But there do seem to be certain differences within the bloc when it comes to the decision whether to impose further sanctions or to wait until the current sanctions that are in place can have all the effect that European leaders want to. So there seem to be two blocks here forming. On the one hand, those who believe that momentum should continue, that the European Union should continue to impose sanctions as they have done in the past, that they should do even the same with stronger sanctions. For example, there are other countries that, on the other hand, have suggested that it's time to maybe stop and wait until the current sanctions have their full effect. So the question is not only what sanctions could be imposed next. As I say, one of the options could be including further Russian banks on this SWIFT ban, but whether to do so. And one of the questions here is also whether that next step could also include banning Russian gas imports. And in this particular case, European Union countries certainly differ, and that depends essentially on how dependent those countries are on Russian energy. Germany, but not only Germany, other countries like Hungary as well, are particularly dependent on Russian gas, Russian oil, Russian coal as well. And as such, they believe that having a ban on Russian energy imports could not only affect Russia, but would also have a massive impact at home, with Germany's economy minister stressing that there could be poverty and mass unemployment as a result if this is done without further precaution as a step in the right direction.
I suppose it's very easy to call for a ban on Russian oil and gas if you don't use all that much oil and gas. It sort of flows that if you do use a lot, it's going to be a lot more difficult to find the replacement. That's almost to be expected, I suppose. Although, I suppose with every sanction, there's going to be a cost for the country, not only that is that sanction is applied to, but for that country that applies that sanction.
And Germany is very much aware of that. I remember a few weeks ago, Annalena Baerbock, the country's foreign minister, stressing that Germany would be willing to pay a price, an economic price in particular, if that meant that Germany could contribute towards finding peace in Ukraine. And by the way, that's something else that polls here in Germany also signal when it comes to public support to the way the current government has been handling the crisis.
Is the
question
German
obviously
public supportive of this move? Is Chancellor Scholz been seen to be doing well? Of course, he's gone further and faster, I think, than many people would have expected when it came to defence spending and indeed sanctions. Does that have the backing of the German people?
It does have the backing of the German people. So it's important to stress that Germany, and in particular the current government, made an important shift on foreign and defense policy, not only by deciding to send defensive weapons to Ukraine, something that they had refused to do so in the past, but also increasing defense spending here in Germany altogether. And this is something that Germans are supportive of. They're not so supportive when it comes to sending even more weapons to Ukraine, even more dangerous weapons to Ukraine. But in general, the shift here in German foreign and defense policy has been accompanied by a shift also in public perception. And this is one of the reasons why the German government has also moved in this direction. Had there been not enough public support, let's say, I think it would have been more difficult for the German government to move in the direction that they did move in the end.
Could this, in your view, be a precursor to a move to more European military independence from, for example, the United States? Back in the days when Germany was not spending particularly high amounts of cash on its military, it was very much sort of in the wing of whatever the states decided to do. Potentially, we're seeing a more independent European military force come as a result of this.
Well, what you hear officially from German politicians is that they do obviously want to make sure that within the European Union there is at least unity when it comes not only to the sanctions that are imposed, but also when it comes to the military reaction to all this situation in Ukraine, to the war in Ukraine. But it is obviously important, and that's something that German officials do stress as well, that they want to work hand in hand with the United States as part of NATO. So Germany does not see itself as a military power by itself. It sees itself as a military power within the European Union and within the NATO structure. So as such, for example, Germany has in the past moved some of its troops to NATO's eastern flanks and so on. But those are all moves that are done very much in cohesion within other European Union countries, and especially also within the United States as well.
Well, Thomas Sparrow, thank you for talking us through all of that. Correspondent in Germany, of course. Really interesting stuff to see what the Central European view is on all of these issues. Well, coming up after the break, we'll be talking to the Tory MP John Penrose on what the Chancellor needs to do tomorrow. But first, it's the GB News headlines with Rhiannon Jones.
Thanks, Tom. It's 3:35. Your top stories from the GB newsroom. Ukraine's foreign ministry says 300,000 people trapped in the occupied city of Kherson are now running out of food and medical supplies. The country is also pleading with Russia to let citizens leave Mariupol. The Deputy Prime Minister claims Russian forces are blocking humanitarian corridors and preventing supplies from reaching the city. Jailed Kremlin critic Alexei Navalny has been sentenced to 9 years in a maximum security prison in Russia for large-scale fraud. Navalny is one of President Putin's most prominent critics. He's already serving a 2.5-year sentence for parole violations relating to charges he says are fabricated. A 22-year-old man has appeared in court charged with murdering Sabita Tanwani. The 19-year-old died at student accommodation in Clerkenwell in central London in the early hours of Saturday morning. Tunisian national Maher Marouf, of no fixed address, has also been accused of attacking a police officer. He's been remanded in custody until Thursday. Neighbours of a 17-month-old girl who died after a dog attack at her home have spoken of their shock. Residents in the Blackbrook area of St Helens have described Bella Ray Birch as a beautiful little girl. The dog had only been with the family a week. It's since been put down. And the number of COVID patients in Scotland's hospitals reached a record high for the second day in a row. Official figures show 2,221 people are currently in hospital with the virus. Almost 12,000 new cases and 37 deaths were also reported. It comes as other parts of the UK also see a surge in cases. TV online and DAB Plus radio, this is GB News. Don't go anywhere. The briefing with Tom Harwood will be back in just a moment.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel.
Right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back. Now, tomorrow, the Chancellor will report his spring statement in the House of Commons, where he's come under intense pressure to tackle soaring living costs facing UK households. Prices are rising at the fastest pace in 3 decades, and wages have not kept up with that pace, adding to an intensifying squeeze on households. Speculation has grown recently over what could be announced, with reports of an increase in national insurance thresholds, lowering the pain for those on the lowest incomes, and potentially a 5p cut in fuel duty. Well, what are the prospects of these potential changes? With me now is Conservative MP for Weston-super-Mare, John Penrose. Welcome to the programme, John. I suppose, first of all, in this discussion, we need to look at what Rishi Sunak is facing. It's not just Britain that's facing record inflation, but the whole of the Western world. The fundamentals of this spring statement, the fundamentals that it is facing up to, are pretty bleak.
Absolutely right, Tom. And you're absolutely right to point out that it is an international problem. It was already quite tricky because post-pandemic, all sorts of weird things were happening to international supply lines, all sorts of things that have to be shipped in from China in normal times. Ships were in the wrong places. There were shortages of raw materials. All sorts of things had needed to be upgraded and invested in. And then on top of that, of course, we've got the conflict in Ukraine. That's had a huge impact on particularly energy prices, but other things as well. And so, nobody, Rishi Sunak or anybody else, his opposite numbers in other countries, can act like King Canute and sort of hold back the tide. That doesn't work. And so he's got a very, very difficult backdrop against which to deliver this long expected statement.
There have been a number of out there suggestions and some more middle-of-the-road suggestions. Some think tanks saying that the Chancellor should simply give people free cash. Others suggesting that rate threshold rises would be a better solution. In your view, Do you think that the Chancellor will be more conservative with a small c, if I can use that phrase, or could there be some sort of large rabbit to be expected tomorrow?
Well, I think he's going to have he's caught between a rock and a hard place, effectively, because he has, if he's a proper conservative, and he is, he's going to want to make sure that we aren't running up the nation's credit card, that we are following sound money principles and not spending money we haven't got. So he can't just borrow willy-nilly, and particularly because we had to borrow an enormous amount because of the pandemic. You can't carry on doing that indefinitely. So he's going to want to make sure that he isn't spending money that it doesn't exist. But he also knows that if he doesn't do something to cope with the rising cost of living, and that will involve trying to get more money back into people's pockets, then actually that's also very bad for the economy, because you end up with falling demand and everybody sort of struggling to make ends meet. So it's a very, very difficult situation. My guess is that what he will do is try and stick to sound money mostly, but he's got a little bit of extra money coming in because those rising prices means that VAT receipts will have gone up. He'll be getting more money in because VAT is a percentage of those rising prices. So he's getting a bit more money in than he thought. That might give him a little bit of extra cash to do something on, for example, fuel duty, or you mentioned national insurance thresholds, something like that, in order to help a bit in the short term. But ultimately, the long-term answer has to be to do reforms to things like the energy market, so that the cost of that energy has to fall over time as we bring in more renewables, which are with prices falling rather than rising. That's the long-term answer, and anything he does will only be a short-term measure.
Now, the UK experienced some pretty impressive growth last year, the fastest growth in the G7. Although the projections for growth now over the course of this year and next year are reducing pretty quickly. It becomes pretty anemic in pretty short order. Do you think this government is prioritising growth enough, or is it just resting on the laurels that last year was pretty good?
I think that, again, this is your point to start off with about this being an international crisis. If you ram up prices, or if prices go up, not because of anything that we've done in this country, but because of those international trends that we were just talking about just now, that has a really bad effect on growth. Rather understandably, it sucks money out of the economy. And that means that growth naturally will slow. And one of the things that he's got to try and fight against is to find ways to do those fundamental underlying reforms I was just talking about, to keep growth going in spite of rapidly rising, spiralling energy costs. That's a really difficult trick to pull off without trying to sort of borrow your way out of trouble, which again, you can't spend money you don't have, or you can't do it for very long, put it that way.
Certainly not. I mean, looking at some of the challenges that the Chancellor faces, indeed, as we've rightly been saying, that the Western world faces, how much of the inflation issue do you believe came from the easy money that we saw over the course of the pandemic? All of the stimulus effects that the government did, pumping money into the economy, that surely has had an effect in increasing the money supply and raising prices.
It will certainly have had an effect. I suspect also, though, that the other factors are at least as big, if not much bigger, potentially. And those are the effects on the supply chains I was talking about before, all these things that normally come to us from places like China, and also this enormous, great big price shock coming from the price of energy. And if you think about it, energy is one of the things that underpins an awful lot of everything that we buy. There's energy in that supply chain somewhere, so it has a knock-on effect to almost everything. The point is that quite a lot of things we were buying less of during the pandemic because we were all in lockdown and those sorts of things. And therefore, the capacity, the factories that were making whatever it is we were buying, sort of scaled back. They didn't have to work as fast, they didn't have to work as hard, and they scaled back. Now, as things get back to normal, demand's going back up to normal levels. The factories aren't tooled up, and that's one of the things that is fundamentally driving all this inflation. So it may be, you're right, that some of the things that happened during the pandemic with easy money made a difference, but all these other factors are at least as big, and probably in many cases, in many sectors, bigger still.
I wonder, looking at the basics of tax and spend, I listened closely to what the Chancellor said in Blackpool on Friday when he had not quite a speech, but an interview with another MP. And he seemed to be suggesting that he had to raise taxes early now to deal with this deficit, and he wants to be very hawkish when it comes to the deficit, or at least as hawkish as he can be. But then he wants to cut taxes later on in the Parliament. Does that make any kind of economic sense, to raise taxes first in order to cut them later? Surely, if you want to spur growth, you cut the taxes first, you don't raise them.
Well, there's two factors going on. I mean, one is the grubby but absolutely unavoidable factor of politics and electoral cycles. So you really don't want, if you have any ambition at all to get re-elected, to be raising taxes near a general election. But also there is economic sense behind it too. And the reason why is because we have the most enormous backlog of NHS patients waiting for all sorts of non-COVID treatments, things like hip operations, knee replacements, cataract operations, things like that. Some of these people have been waiting for a year or two now, far longer than they should or normally would have to. So we can't just ignore all of them. We have to do something about trying to deal with that as well. But you're right that when Rishi originally announced his plans to, for example, try and pay for all these extra operations and all these other things, he didn't know, because none of us knew at the time, that there was going to be this enormous, great big spike in energy prices. So one of the difficult judgments that he's got to make is, does he stick to his plans, or does he try and delay some of them and try and make sure that you aren't sort of sucking more money out of the economy by a rise in national insurance contributions in order to sort of allow the economy to try and struggle through this and absorb the effects of this enormous, great big energy price rise. Not an easy decision, and one of those things where nobody actually knows the right answer at this stage. At the end of the day, he's going to have to make a decision based on really incomplete information. And the temptation, of course, will be to stick to plan A because that's what everyone's expecting, and it's what is sort of baked in.
It's not an enviable position to be standing at that dispatch box tomorrow at around 12:30 following PMQs, but we will be watching it with close intent. John Penrose, for now, thank you very much for joining us on the briefing to talk through those issues this afternoon. Now, Prime Minister Boris Johnson hosted a roundtable at Downing Street yesterday with the leaders from the nuclear industry to discuss how to improve domestic energy security and rapidly accelerate nuclear projects in the UK. He set out a vision for nuclear to be a major part of the UK's future energy system as a clean, reliable and safe energy source, and laid out a targeted rise in the share of nuclear-produced energy from 15 to 25%. Well, joining me now is former Labour MP Tom Greatex, who's CEO of the Nuclear Industry Association. Welcome to the programme, Tom. First of all, we were talking to an Alba Party MP earlier in the show who laid out a number of concerns about what happens to nuclear power plants at the end of their life, particularly this issue of nuclear waste. Is that a legitimate concern?
Well, it's legitimate in the sense that there is a limited amount of waste which we have to take care of after power stations have stopped generating. But we've done that in this country and around the world for many years. In fact, nuclear is the only energy industry or energy supplier that tracks, manages and pays for its own waste. And you've got to think about how much of that waste there actually is. So for every single person in the UK, for all of the nuclear electricity we've had over the last 60 odd years, which is enough to power every home for 30 years, the cumulative amount of waste for every single person is the equivalent of one dishwasher tablet. So it's a small, concentrated amount, which we know how to deal with. It's not belching into the atmosphere, greenhouse gases. It's not putting into landfill, mercury and other things which don't degrade out of batteries and solar panels. So every energy source has waste. Nuclear is unique in that we look after it and deal with it. And that's exactly what we have done and will continue to do.
That's remarkable. A dishwasher tablet size. That seems. Yep, I mean, I know that there are some schemes, particularly in Norway, to bury this waste very, very deep into bedrock. That seems to be relatively simple to deal with. However, the other big worry, the big question about a big nuclear scale-up is we can see how powerful nuclear energy is to deal with our needs. It does take time to build. This will not be a quick fix. Even if we started building a dozen nuclear power stations today, this would take years before it came on stream, would it not?
It would, and that's why, the best time to build a nuclear power station was 10 years ago. The second best time is now, because in 10 years' time, if we don't, we'll still be facing the same issues, which is a combination, as we've seen over the last few months, of pretty low wind yield or comparatively low wind yield, despite the investment in capacity, increases in gas prices, which no government can control and are affected by a whole number of international factors that feed into the wider issues in terms of inflation in the economy, cost of living, and everything else that derives from it. When we had an energy shock, an oil shock in the 1970s, what France decided to do was to build a fleet of nuclear power stations. And over the course of 15 or so years, they built a lot of them. And they built them and they're operating now. And that means 85% of electricity in France is from nuclear. That means they have a decarbonised power grid already. And they're insulated compared to other European countries from the various different international factors that are causing the crisis we're dealing with at the moment.
85% of French electricity is an extraordinarily high percentage. With the UK aiming for just 25% of our electricity to come from nuclear, is that ambition too low? Is the Prime Minister not being entirely truthful when he's speaking about a nuclear revolution, really? Should we not be aiming for more?
No, I think, look, in the 1970s and 80s, you didn't have the ability to scale up offshore wind to the extent, and the UK is fortunate that it has a significant offshore wind resource. But it's about how you best get a low carbon mix that means you've got low costs and predictable costs, that you aren't adding to the environmental impact of greenhouse gases, but you maintain a security of supply, both in terms of sovereign energy, but also reliability and dependability of supply for homes and businesses and everybody else that uses electricity. So, nuclear as a proportion of that is right, I think. We should stop thinking about this as one technology versus another, or one clean technology versus another, but how we best calibrate that mix. But by the same token, for those people who suggest you can try to do it and to get to net zero and to have a secure, reliable system without nuclear, I think they are people who are actually making this situation worse than it needs to be. We need to be doing wind as well as nuclear, and we need to be making sure we're using all the other technologies that are around in terms of storage, demand management, all those things to make sure we've got that secure, reliable supply. And nuclear is going to be an integral part of it. And that finally, belatedly perhaps, but finally, and in welcome terms, is what's been recognised this week from the Prime Minister and from the government much more explicitly than in the past. And we now need to get on and deliver it so that next time there's a crisis in relation to energy prices, we're much more insulated and in a much better position.
It is remarkable that even if we were having this conversation perhaps 6 months ago, there was equivocation from the opposition and from the government over this issue. It seems remarkably quickly, all it's taken is an energy crisis to get both the government and the opposition firmly behind nuclear now. I suppose the final question, and I'm really sorry, we only have 30 seconds to discuss it, is who's going to pay?
Who pays? Well, consumers will pay, but they'll pay less by having an energy mix, an electricity power mix where the cost is predictable, rather than what they've been seeing at the moment, which is cost prices going hugely up because of the impact of gas wholesale prices. That's what we want to get away from for environmental and economic reasons.
So there might be a cost, but it might be more stable and predictable in the long term. Well, Tom Greatrex, CEO
and lower than current bills
Association, thank you for joining us here on The Briefing. I'm afraid that is the end of the interview and indeed the end of the programme. You've been watching The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood. I'm back for The Briefing at 9:30 a.m. tomorrow. Now, don't forget about tomorrow. We have the Spring Statement live on GB News from 11 a.m. We'll bring you analysis on the Chancellor's announcements throughout the day and tips to beat that financial squeeze. That's all I've got for today. Up next, it's Colin Brazier, who has a fantastic show with some brilliant guests. But before that, let's take a little look at what might be in the latest weather forecast. I can hear that it might be a little bit sunny across the United Kingdom today.
Hello again, I'm Aidan McGivern. Smashing afternoon out there for most of us, and it's going to stay that way until at least the end of the weekend. Blue skies, feeling warm, odd shower possible, but that's the exception rather than the rule. Generally speaking, high pressure to the east of the UK is maintaining a warm and dry feed of air from the continent, and as a result, virtually cloud-free skies. Not entirely as we go through the evening. Some medium-level cloud drifts north. That could give the odd shower for North Wales, North Midlands, Northern England, for example. Either way, it disappears by the end of the night, and under extensive clear skies, a few fog patches start to form into northeast England, eastern England as well. Temperatures dipping away as well, I think a few degrees above freezing for towns and cities, perhaps just dipping below in some sheltered spots. So chill in the air first thing tomorrow, but plenty of blue skies and sunshine, even where we've got the fog first thing. That disappears very quickly. And then for the vast majority, another dry day. Just the chance of a shower there for the far north of Scotland as temperatures rise, perhaps for eastern England as well, and widely from the north of Scotland